locked the church door like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. My stepson stood with his arms crossed, his sister beside him, and the youngest one a half step behind, looking everywhere except at me. Family only past this point, Bradford said, and he didn't even lower his voice. We need to keep this part private. I had been married to their father for 26 years. The funeral home parking lot was full of cars I half recognized. Friends from the Lake Association, 2 men from the Rotary Club who had been pallbearers an hour ago, a woman from the church choir who reached out and squeezed my elbow as she walked by, then froze when she saw what was happening at the door and slipped inside without looking back. I don't blame her. People don't know what to do when something ugly happens in a place that's supposed to be sacred. I held my purse with both hands. Inside was a sealed, manila envelope I'd carried with me to every appointment, every meeting, every doctor's visit for the last 4 years. My husband had given it to me on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting at our kitchen table with the lake glittering behind him through the window, and he had said, "Tuck this somewhere safe, sweetheart. You won't need it for a long while. But when you do need it, you'll know." I needed it now. "Sweetheart," I said, and I used the word on purpose because it was what their father called me, and I wanted them to hear it in their own ears. I am family. I was your father's wife. Bradford's jaw set. His sister, Marissa, gave me the small, tight smile that I had been receiving from her since the day I married her father in 1999. "Stepwife," she said, "there's a difference and you know it." The youngest, Connor, looked at his shoes. I looked past them through the open church door. I could see the casket at the front, the spray of white lilies I had ordered myself, the program with my husband's name on the front and the typeface he'd liked. I could see the pew where I was supposed to sit. The first pew. The one for the widow. "Where would you like me to go?" I said quietly. I wasn't asking permission. I was asking them to say it out loud, in front of God and the parking lot and anyone walking by, exactly where they thought a wife of 26 years belonged on the day she buried her husband. Marissa flushed. Bradford didn't. "There are seats in the back," he said. "It would be more appropriate." I nodded once. I didn't trust my voice. I turned and walked, not to the back of the church, but back to my car, and I sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the keys in my lap, and I cried. Not loud. Not the kind of crying that makes a scene. The kind that comes out of you sideways, in little gasps, while you stare at the steering wheel and try to remember how to breathe. After a few minutes, I opened my purse. The envelope was still there. Of course it was. I hadn't planned to use it today. I had planned to bury my husband, accept the casseroles, and go home to a house that had become too quiet 4 days ago. I had planned to grieve. That was all I had planned. But my husband, God rest him, had planned for more than that. He had planned for this. I got out of the car. I walked back across the parking lot. I went around the side of the church and entered through the door near the choir room, the way I had entered for 26 years of Christmas services and Easter Sundays. The pastor was standing in the hallway adjusting his collar. He looked up and his face did a small, complicated thing. "I was told you had stepped out," he said. "Did they tell you that?" I said. "Or did you assume it?" He didn't answer. I walked past him into the sanctuary. The organist was already playing the prelude. People turned in their pews when they saw me come in from the side. Bradford and Marissa and Connor were already seated in the front row, in the seats meant for me. Bradford's wife was there too. Marissa's husband. 3 grandchildren. I had bought Christmas gifts for every year since they were born. The whole row claimed. I didn't try to take a seat in the front. I walked instead to the second pew, and I sat down on the aisle, alone, and I set my purse on the bench beside me with the manila envelope inside it, and I folded my hands in my lap and I waited for the service to begin. The service was beautiful, and I'm grateful for that much. The pastor said true things about my husband. The choir sang the hymns my husband loved. A man he'd worked with for 40 years got up and told a story about a fishing trip in Minnesota that made the whole room laugh through tears. I cried. I cried hard. I had loved this man. I had loved him every single day of 26 years. And the fact that his children had treated me like an inconvenience an hour ago did not change the fact that I had just lost him. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a stepmother. The grief and the insult arrive at the same time, and you have to carry both. After the service, there was a reception in the church hall. Bradford had organized it. I had not been consulted. The catering was from a place my husband had hated, and there were no deviled eggs, which were the only thing he ever asked for at any gathering, and which I had made for every potluck of his life. I mentioned this to no one. I stood by the punch bowl and accepted condolences from people who knew exactly what was happening and didn't know what to do about it. A woman I'd known for 15 years pressed my hand and whispered, "Are you all right?" And I said, "I will be." I meant it, because at 3 o'clock the next afternoon, I had an appointment at the law office downtown, and I knew what was in the manila envelope, and I knew what my husband had done, even if his 3 children did not. Let me back up. I met my husband when I was 41 years old. I had been widowed 5 years by then. My first husband, who I had loved deeply and who had loved me, died of a stroke at 43 with no warning at all. He left me with a son, a mortgage, and a hole in the center of my chest that I genuinely believed would never close. I lived alone with my boy in a small ranch house on the edge of a small town in upstate New York for 5 years, and I did not date, and I did not look, and I did not want to. I met my second husband at a hardware store. I needed a part for my furnace. He worked the counter on Saturdays as a favor to the owner, who was his oldest friend. He was a widower himself. His wife had died of cancer 8 years earlier. He had 3 grown children who did not visit him often. He was kind to me at the counter. He explained the part. He asked, with no agenda I could detect, whether I had someone to install it. I said I'd figure it out. He said I could come by Tuesday if you'd like. No charge. I'm not great company, but I'm decent with a wrench. He came by Tuesday. He was decent with a wrench. He stayed for coffee. My son, who was 13 and had been wary of every man who looked at me twice since his father died, sat at the kitchen table and watched him for the entire visit. After he left, my son said, "He's not pretending." That was the highest praise my son ever gave anyone. We were married 18 months later. I had told him before I said yes that my son came first. He said, of course. I had told him before I said yes that I would never try to replace his children's mother and would never expect them to call me anything they didn't want to call me anything they didn't want to call me. He said, of course, he had told me before he asked that his children would probably not be easy. He said his oldest, Bradford, was a lawyer in Chicago and considered every situation a negotiation. He said his middle, Marlis, was very close to her late mother's memory and might never warm to me. He said his youngest, Connor, was a good kid who lived in his older sibling's shadow and would take whatever cue they gave him. He was right about all 3. The first Christmas after the wedding, Marlis gave me a gift card to a store I had never been to and never expressed interest in. The card was for $10. Bradford did not come. Connor came and was polite and left early. My son, who was 15 by then, watched all of this with the same expression he'd had at the kitchen table 2 years earlier. And afterward he said to me, "Mom, you don't have to make them like you. You just have to keep being you." He was a smart kid. He's a smart man now. You'll meet him in this story. For 26 years I tried with my husband's children. I sent birthday cards. I remembered grandkids' names. I drove 4 hours to attend a graduation that I was thanked for attending in the same tone you'd thank a stranger who held a door. I sat through Thanksgivings where I was seated at the corner of the table. I bit my tongue when Bradford referred to me, in front of my husband, as Dad's wife, instead of by my name. I bit it again when Marlis, at her own daughter's wedding, introduced me to the photographer as a family friend. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had my husband, and I had my son, and that was enough. What I didn't know, for many years, was that my husband was paying attention. He was a quiet man. That was one of the first things I loved about him. He didn't say things to fill silence. When he spoke, he meant it. And he was watching the whole time. The way his children treated me and the way he saw it was not the way I described it to myself. He saw it for what it was. About 4 years before he died, he asked me to come with him to an attorney's office. He didn't tell me why. He said, "I want to take care of some things, and I want you there." The attorney was a woman about my age, sharp-eyed, with a calm voice. My husband had been seeing her for several months without telling me. He had restructured everything. The lake house, which had been in his name, was now held in irrevocable trust, and I was the sole successor trustee. The investment account, which his first wife had originally helped him build, had been retitled. There was a separate trust for his 3 children, which would receive a portion of his assets upon his death. But the bulk of the estate, and the lake house specifically, were going to me. There was also a smaller trust for my son, which he had set up without telling either of us, naming my son as a beneficiary alongside his own grandchildren. I started crying in that office. I couldn't help it. He took my hand. He said, "Sweetheart, you raised that boy alone for 5 years before I ever met him. He's been a son to me for 22 years. He calls me when his car breaks down. He asks my advice. He came up here and helped me build the dock the summer I had my knee replaced. He is family." "They are not the way they should be." I said, "But they're your children." He said, "And I love them. I provided for them. They will not be poor, but I am not going to leave the woman who has loved me for 22 years to sit at the corner of a table and beg my children for the chair I bought her." He squeezed my hand. He said, "I know what they'll do when I'm gone. I know you don't believe me, but I know my own children. So I'm telling you now, and I'm putting it in writing so that when the day comes, you will not have to fight. You will only have to show them what is already true." The attorney slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside were certified copies of every document: the trust, the deed, the retitled accounts. A letter in his handwriting addressed to me. He said, "Put this somewhere safe. You won't need it for a long while, but when you do need it, you'll know." I put it in the bottom drawer of my dresser, under the sweaters I never wore. I forgot about it for a long time. I went on with our life. We had 4 more good years. He developed Parkinson's the year after that meeting. Slowly at first, and then less slowly, and the last 2 years of his life were hard. And I was the one who was there. Every appointment, every medication, every long night. His children visited twice a year, usually for an afternoon, and they always left with a list of things they thought I should be doing differently. Bradford in particular liked to ask in a tone that pretended to be casual about the arrangements, about the house, about what was going to happen if Dad needed more care. I would answer briefly and change the subject. My husband, when he was lucid, would catch my eye across the room and give me the smallest nod. He knew. He always knew. He died on a Saturday morning in his own bed with his hand in mine and the lake outside the window and the dog at his feet. It was a good death, as deaths go. I sat with him for almost an hour before I called anyone, and the first call I made was to my son, and the second call I made was to the attorney. The third call, the one to Bradford, I made an hour after that. He took it on the second ring. He said, "I'm so sorry, Esme. We'll be there as soon as we can. We'll handle everything." That word, handle. I knew right then what was coming. They arrived the next day, all 3 of them, with spouses and grown children and a level of organization that made me understand they had been preparing for this. Bradford had spreadsheets. Marissa had a binder. Within 48 hours of my husband's death, they had decided where the funeral would be held, who would speak, what the program would say, what the catering would be, and who would sit where. I was consulted on none of it. When I tried to mention that my husband had wanted to be buried in the small cemetery near the lake, not the large one near the church. Bradford said, "We've already made arrangements. It's easier this way. Dad would understand." I let it go. I let all of it go. I was too tired to fight, and I was too sad. And a small part of me, even then, was watching them, the way my husband had watched them, and I was making a list. They never asked about the will. Not once. In those 4 days between his death and the funeral, I think they assumed they already knew what was in it. I think Bradford, the lawyer, had drafted it in his head years ago. The lake house split 3 ways. The account split 3 ways. The widow with a small monthly support and an expectation that she'd downsize and move on. I think that's the version of the will that lived in his head. And I think it lived there so confidently that he never even imagined another version was possible. Then they blocked me from the church door. The reception ended. People left. I drove home, alone, to the lake house I had loved for 26 years and which now, technically, was mine and mine alone. My husband's 3 children and their families went back to the rental house Bradford had arranged for them on the other side of the lake. They had not invited me to dinner. I had not invited them to mine. My son arrived that evening. He had flown in for the funeral and stood beside me through the whole service from his seat in the second pew, and he had wanted to walk up to Bradford right there in the church parking lot and have words, and I had stopped him with a hand on his arm and a small shake of my head. He had trusted me, the way he had trusted me since he was 13 and watched a man fix my furnace. That night in my kitchen, with the lake going dark outside the window, my son made me a grilled cheese sandwich because that is what he made me the night his father died, and the night he got into college, and the night I called to tell him my second husband had been diagnosed with Parkinson's. Grilled cheese is my son's love language. I ate it. I drank the tea he made me. I told him finally what was in the envelope. He set down his mug. He looked at me for a long moment. He set down his mug. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Mom, you have to use it." I said, "I don't want to fight." He said, "You're not the one starting the fight. They started it at the door. You're just finishing it." I slept on it. The next morning, I called the attorney and confirmed our 3 o'clock appointment. Then I called Bradford. I said, "I'd like all 3 of you to come to the law office downtown at 3 this afternoon. There are some things to go through." He said, "Of course." We were going to suggest that ourselves. I bet he was. They arrived in 3 separate cars. They walked into the conference room with the same expressions they had worn at the church door, like they were being inconvenienced by a formality. Bradford had brought a yellow legal pad. Marissa had brought her binder. Connor sat down quietly and didn't take anything out of his bag. The attorney came in. I had introduced her to all 3 of them once, years ago, at a Thanksgiving when my husband had mentioned offhand that she was handling some estate planning. They had not paid attention. They did not recognize her now. She sat down at the head of the table. She opened her own folder. She said, "Thank you for coming. My condolences to all of you. I'd like to walk you through your father's final estate plan." Bradford leaned forward. "Before we begin," he said, in his courtroom voice, "I'd like to confirm that all relevant parties have been notified. Esme, you are of course welcome to be present, but the substantive discussion really should be among the children. I'm sure you understand." The attorney looked at him. She didn't blink. "Mr. Halverson," she said, "the substantive discussion is with Mrs. Halverson. You are present as a courtesy because your father loved you and wanted you to hear this in person. But the estate is not yours to discuss." I watched his face change. It was very slow, like watching ice crack on the lake in March. She slid the documents across the table. She walked them through it, one item at a time, in a voice that was patient and entirely without cruelty. The lake house was held in a revocable trust dated 9 years prior, of which I was the sole successor trustee and beneficiary. The investment accounts had been retitled 6 years prior into joint ownership with right of survivorship and were now mine in their entirety. The vehicles were mine. The boat was mine. The cabin in the Adirondacks, which Bradford had been telling his own children for years was going to be theirs someday, was held in the same revocable trust and was mine. There was a separate, smaller trust for the three of them. It was funded with a sum that was, by any normal measure, generous. It was nothing close to what they had assumed they would receive. It was less than half of what they had assumed. There was also, the attorney said, a trust for one other beneficiary, a young man named after his late father. My son. Bradford had stopped writing on his legal pad about 3 minutes earlier. Marlissa's binder was closed. Connor had not moved. Bradford said, "This is not the will my father told me about." The attorney said, "This is the only estate plan your father executed in the last decade. Any document or conversation that suggests otherwise is not legally operative. The plan you are looking at is signed, witnessed, and notarized, and it has been on file in this office for 9 years." He said, "I'll contest this." She said, very calmly, "You may certainly try. I would caution you as a fellow attorney that the documentation is exceptionally clean. Your father anticipated the possibility of a contest. He left a notarized letter explaining his reasoning, which is in the file. He also requested an evaluation of mental capacity at the time of signing, conducted by his physician, which is in the file. The contest would be expensive. It would not succeed." Marla said in a very small voice, "What about the things in the house?" "Mom's things." I almost cried right then. Because she was, I realized, finally calling me by something close to a real word, and the question she was asking was the only honest one any of them had asked me in 26 years. I said, "Marlis, your mother's things have always been your mother's." I packed her jewelry, her photo albums, her wedding dress, and the quilt she made you when you were 10 in 3 boxes the year I moved in. They're in the cedar chest in the guest room. They've been there for 26 years. You can come pick them up whenever you'd like. I should have given them to you a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't." She started crying. Quietly. Into her hands. Bradford did not cry. Bradford gathered his legal pad and his pen and stood up and said, "I'd like to discuss this in private with my siblings." I said, "You're welcome to. The conference room next door is open." He walked out. Marlis followed him, still crying. Connor stayed. He sat there for a long minute. Then he looked at me. He said, "Esme, I'm sorry." I waited. He said, "I knew this was going to happen." At the door. I knew Bradford was going to do it. I should have stopped him. He stopped. He looked down at his hands. He said, "I've been doing what they told me to do my whole life." I said, "I know you have, sweetheart." He looked up. I said, "Your father knew it too. That's why he left you the same as the other two, even though you were the only one who came to see him this past Christmas. He believed you'd find your way out from under your siblings someday. He told me so." Connor was crying now, the way grown men cry, with his shoulders shaking and his face turned to the side. He didn't try to hide it. He said, "Can I come up to the lake? Sometime. Just to see it. The way it was." I said, "You can come up any time. You're his son. That doesn't change." He nodded. He stood up. He walked out of the conference room without going to find his siblings. I heard later, from the attorney's secretary, that he drove straight to the airport and flew home, alone. Bradford filed a contest 2 weeks later. It was dismissed in 4 months. He has not spoken to me since. Marlis called me once, about 3 months after the funeral, and asked if she could come pick up her mother's things. I said yes, and I had them ready when she came, and I made her coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour, and we did not exactly become friends, but we were not enemies anymore, and that was something. Connor came up to the lake the following summer. He brought his daughter, who was 9, and had never been to the lake house her grandfather built. I made grilled cheese. My son drove down for the weekend and they spent a whole afternoon out on the dock together. And at one point I looked out the window and saw two grown men, one of them my child and one of them my husband's child, fishing side by side in the lake my husband loved, and I thought, well, look at that. I'm 71 years old now. The lake house is still mine. I sit on the porch most evenings with the dog at my feet, and I think about my husband and the manila envelope he gave me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. And I think about what it means to be loved by someone who is paying attention. He saw me the whole time. He saw the corner of the table and the $10 gift card and the family friend at the wedding, and he never said much about any of it because he wasn't a man who said much, but he did the one thing that mattered. He put it in writing. He made sure that on the worst day of my life, when his children stood at the door of a church and told me I wasn't family, I had something in my purse that said otherwise. I want to say something to you, if you're listening to this. If you have spent years being seated at the corner of the table, being introduced as a friend, being thanked the way you'd thank a stranger, being told in small ways and big ways that you are a guest in a life you have actually been living, hear me. You are not imagining it. You are not being too sensitive. You are seeing what is there. And you do not have to wait for them to give you the seat. You do not have to ask. You do not have to perform gratitude for crumbs from a table you have helped set for 2 decades. Sometimes the people who love you best are the ones who quietly, without telling you, prepare a way out for you. A son who makes grilled cheese. A husband who goes to a lawyer. A stranger who fixes your furnace and stays for coffee. And sometimes, when the door closes in your face, the answer is not to push it open and demand to be let in. The answer is to walk around the side of the building and come in through the door you have always used, and to sit down in your seat and to wait. The truth comes out. It always does. It came out for me in a conference room downtown on a Tuesday afternoon, with 3 children of a man I loved sitting across from me, finally seeing what their father had seen all along. I'm not angry anymore. I haven't been for a long time. What I feel, mostly, is grateful. To my husband for paying attention. To my son for the grilled cheese. To Connor for finding his way to the dock. And to anyone who has ever stood at a door they had every right to walk through and been told they weren't family, I want you to know, you are. You always were. And anyone who couldn't see it was the one who wasn't looking. I've been thinking a lot, in the years since that Tuesday afternoon in the conference room, about why things unfold the way they do. Not in some mystical sense. In the plain, ordinary sense of cause and effect. Because nothing that happened to me at that church door was random. It was the natural result of choices made over decades by people who believed they would never have to answer for them. Bradford spent 26 years treating me like an obstacle. Marlis spent 26 years introducing me as a friend. Connor spent 26 years staying quiet. None of them imagined those years were adding up to anything. But they were. They were adding up in the eyes of a man who watched everything and said little, and when he sat down at a lawyer's office 4 years before he died, he was not being vindictive. He was being honest about what he had seen. The will he wrote was not a punishment. It was a description of what had actually happened in our family for 2.5 decades. That is what I want my own life to teach me going forward. That every small kindness I give, and every small cruelty I hand out, is being noticed by someone, even if I never see them watching. I want to be the kind of woman who is found, at the end, to have been generous in private. Not generous for credit. Generous because that's who I was when no one was keeping score. I think a lot, too, about my son standing in my kitchen with a grilled cheese sandwich, telling me I had to use the envelope. He is not a hard man. He is one of the gentlest people I know. But he understood something I had been slow to understand, which is that letting yourself be erased is not a virtue. Bearing insult after insult in silence is not strength. There is a difference between being patient and being passive, and I had crossed that line a long time ago and called it grace. Real strength. The kind I want to grow into now is the strength to stand up quietly, to walk back around the side of the church, to sit down in your own seat without making a scene, and to wait for the truth to do its work. It does not require shouting. It does not require cruelty. It only requires that you stop apologizing for taking up space you have every right to occupy. If you are a woman who has been seated at the corner of a table for 20 years, hear me now. You do not need to fight for the seat. You only need to stop pretending the corner is where you belong. Pay attention to who is paying attention to you. Trust the people who show up without being asked. And when the day comes that someone tells you you are not family, do not waste your breath arguing. Just open the envelope. The truth was always there. You only had to be brave enough to read it out loud.